Hello, and welcome back to the Studio Scoria channel. My name is Maz, and today we'll be talking about space in Scoria, a brief history of space, space travel, and the overview of the Sul System. So let's get into it, shall we? Early history. So ancient civilizations in Scoria have always been fascinated with the stars, and here we have a couple brief examples of some of those civilizations that were always fascinated with space and the stars. You got the Empire of Nir, which was in fact, I believe, the earliest empire to ever been founded, period. Uh, Certainly a very influential one. Hrena, which is a very prominent maritime kingdom in Valscoria, as well as the Dazao, Danzao dynasties in Illustrious, the Katos in Talmer, the Samundari in Insular Vasuna, and among others. I didn't put them here, but I did want to talk about as well the Dura kingdom and the Dura states. This was a very interesting religion founded in the eastern part of Illustrious, and they've always had a very special fascination, reverence of what they called the four hot moons. And these were, if I remember correctly, let's research real quick, shall we? Because I know they're recorded somewhere. Apologies. I do want to talk about it, though. So let's see if I can pull them up. Yeah, so the four hot moons, according to a very old nation states fact book, were Ikja, Sheda, Mua, and Kora. And I believe, if I remember correctly, so these were the three brightest stars, observable stars, from Scoria, in addition to the Sul, which we'll talk about in this presentation, which is the star that Scoria orbits around. So, yeah, those are the four hot moons. But moving on, so the earliest recordings of planets and stars were charted by astronomers in the Halkar Empire, and the Halkar Empire exists in present-day northern Laboka, namely in Shudar, which was, so to speak, this was the one of the earliest and most prominent Shudari kingdoms ever, and period. And in addition, we have the earliest recordings of constellations and star charts were plotted by Valscorian sailors, namely Guakins, Hranic peoples, even Wisdens and Vedians. The other groups, such as the Cantians, Valmorans, not super interested in the stars, but they certainly use them in part with their maritime culture as well. And then we have some more early history in regards to intricate rocketry, and these were experimentations to be used as weaponry undertaken in the Fateh Sultanate, which we've discussed a couple times, and perhaps soon enough we'll have a deep dive into the history of the Fateh Sultanate, a very prominent and very interesting state in Scorian history. And now we get into some modern times. And these are some dates I have for you and some notable events. So we have in 491, this is all in DE, by the way, so none of this happened, or excuse me, this all happened in the past, give or take 200 years. So the first weather balloons were invented in Niteria in 491. Then coming up next in 537, the initiation of the Cantanian Firebird program, which was a program they used to, in tandem with their very powerful and prominent Air Force, with regards to space exploration and experiments. And then not too long later, in 541, Cantus becomes the first country to achieve spaceflight in tandem with the Firebird program. And then 7 years later, the GNVV, that's the Guwakin, Nigerian, Valmoran, Vedian space mission, so that's four of the big five members at the time, lands four of their nationals onto the moon of Arcodor. And we'll see in a second why this moon is named in particular, because Scoria has two moons. One of them is Arcodor, the other one is Upsideron, which Cantus landed their men on that moon 2 years later, despite several warnings given the sort of harsh... excuse me, let me turn on the heat real quick. I apologize. It's actually quite warm out. I don't know why I have the heat on here. But despite warnings from other researchers and scientists who were observing the mission, I see Upsideron is a much more volatile orbiting moon compared to Arcodor with regards to safer places to land, etc. So yeah, a lot of warnings there with Upsideron. But despite those warnings, 10 years later, the GNVV mission, which was still an ongoing collective space research team, did send men to Upsideron. So there you go. And then give or take 12 years later, the first unmanned mission into deep space. These are the first successful rovers that they sent out beyond the Sul System to record planets and other foreign bodies in across the stars. And then more recently, we have the first successful rover landing on the planet of Tsuva. We'll talk about Tsuva here in a second. And then as of this year, in fact, the launching of the Catherine Dalton Telescope, which will photograph systems far beyond the reach of the Sul System. So with regards to those unmanned missions in deep space, the Catherine Dalton Telescope is projected to go even further and have a much longer lifespan. And then we'll talk briefly about some other notable missions, such as the Wayfarer missions. There were 3 of them total, and so they were initially sent to observe the planets Oridor and Nova Para. So Wayfarer 1 bears a record called The Great Work, which details much information about Scoria's location, history, and culture, because it was designated after their observance of those planets. They would go beyond the system, and they would bear this information in the hopes of perhaps contacting life that may have existed outside, and share some really interesting details about Scoria. The second Wayfarer mission was sent to get a closer look at Nova Para's atmosphere, but it was destroyed due to the massive heavy pressures in that planet. And the third, which is the last of the Wayfarer missions, has succeeded in this mission. In addition, gathered some more information on Nova Para and the moons. I believe there's 53 of them. We'll talk more about Nova Para in just a second when we talk about, that's right, the Sul System. And these are ordered by proximity to the Sul. And what is the Sul, you might be wondering? I'm sure you have a lot of burning questions. See what I did there? Because it's a star. The Sul is the star at the center of the Sul System. In other words, it's the star all the planets in this system, including Scoria, orbit. And so we have some brief information about the Sul as a classification for the star. It's an A type 0. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, so I apologize. A lot of this information is actually based on the star Sirius A, which is a real star that exists. I think it's the brightest star that we can see with the naked eye, besides the sun, which, I mean, please don't look at the sun with your naked eye, for the love of God. Please don't do that. It'll hurt you. But so when we decided to base the Sul off Sirius A, it's twice as bright and large as our sun. And so for that reason, one astronomical unit in Scoria is actually twice the distance between our sun and the Earth. Sort of our pseudoscience theory for how Scoria could justify life, etc. And so now let's talk about some of the planets that orbit the Sul, shall we? Starting with Shadowrun. Shadowrun is a terrestrial planet, the first one to orbit the Sul, with a surface area of give or take 181 million square kilometers. No rings, no moons. And one complete orbit, or year in this case, would be concluded after 59 Scorian days. The distance from the Sul is 0.41 astronomical units. And this was a planet always known by the ancients with such nicknames as Pearl the Void and the Burning Beauty. And then we'll talk about the names of all these planets as well. So the name Shadowrun is derived from a mythical being in Josei mythology, a burning serpent goddess that was the gatekeeper to the realm of Guriaka, a hellish plane of fire and decadence where beings are sent to, but not for an eternity, only 100,000 years or so before they're reincarnated. So there you go. That's a very key belief in the Josei faith and the name origin of Shadowrun. But moving on, the second planet from the Sul, oh my god, I said the sun, I apologize, is Tsuva. Tsuva is another terrestrial world with a surface area of 375 million square kilometers. It has one ring called Belu and 2 rings made of dust. A year on Tsuva lasts 310 Scorian days, so we're getting closer to, excuse me, I apologize. We're getting closer to sort of the same orbit length as Scoria has, which we'll see here in a second. And it's also 0.95 AU from the Sul as well. Tsuva was also known by the ancients, so there's no real clear definition as to who may have discovered it and what year that might have been. It was always a planet that was observable, even from Scoria, without the use of any special equipment. It has nicknames such as Purgatory and Scoria's sister, given the fact that it lies within the habitable zone and has similar water and vegetation to Scoria, but due to how hot it may be, it's unknown if intelligent life could be sustained on it. And for the record, the one moon on Tsuva is called Belu, and the name Tsuva comes from the goddess Tsuva, the daughter of Hukuru Nguruve, the supreme being in the central Labokan faith known as Tekerism. If we talk about the Kingdom of Dashik, that was the main religion there. Believe me, we'll have many segments where we talk about historical nations, so be sure to stay tuned for that. And next, you know it, I love it, Scoria. Scoria is a terrestrial world with a surface area of 541 million square kilometers. That's about 30 million square kilometers larger than the Earth. It has two moons, Arcodor and Obsidian, which we discussed, and 5 dust rings, which you can see depicted in this, shall we say, exaggerated illustration of the planet. A very good one, nonetheless. And so a year on Scoria lasts 365 days, or 366 if it's a leap year. And it's obviously, as it's the baseline for the AU unit system, it's 1 AU from the Sul. And again, Scoria being the planet that's housed intelligent life and species such as the humans and many other plants and animals. It's known by the ancients, obviously. Has nicknames such as the Motherland and the World, and is comprised of 62.6% water and 37.4% land area. And you might be wondering, where does the name Scoria actually come from? Tell us, Maz, please. The name Scoria actually comes from the Empire of Nir, the Emperor Shkur Tabruzar, a man both highly revered and feared in ancient Visuna, that they named the ground beneath them in his honor. And that's actually a more recent canonical etymology of the planet. That sounded cool, so we went with that. But the real reason Scoria is called Scoria is because Scoria is a type of igneous rock that does exist, spewed from volcanoes and ash and what have you. So we figured, in the same analogy to what Earth is also a synonym for like dirt or ground, Scoria is used in that same light as well. And next up, we have the planet Margadon. Margadon is another terrestrial world with a surface area of 261 million square kilometers. It has 3 moons named Dregir, Ralir, and Urahar. It has 1 ring composed of dust and ice. A year on Margadon is give or take double the orbiting period of Scoria at 687 days, and it lies 2.5 astronomical units away from the Sul. Margadon was discovered in 375 DE by, I believe, the Nigerian astronomer Sylvain Trudeau, and it has nicknames such as Desolation and the Sandbox, given its just bleak, desolate, sandy terrain. And so you might be wondering, what's the name? Excuse me, oh my gosh. What does the name Margadon come from? Margadon was actually the Talmari equivalent of Viator, the Hranic god of war, and the two actually share many similar patronages and depictions. So if you were to ask someone an ancient Talmar, hey, do you know about this Viator guy? They'd be like, oh, you mean Margadon? Dude, hell yeah, I know what Margadon is. So that's Margadon. Moving on to this planet, Katos. And this is where the terrestrial worlds end and more interesting classifications begin. Katos is an oceanic world. The entire world is engulfed in a global ocean with a surface area of 489 million kilometers squared. It has 5 moons named Strilos, Dauramine, Alcraton, Brinary, and Vulcar. Katos has no moons, and 1 year on Katos lasts 1,294 days. The distance from the Sul is 3.2 astronomical units, and it was also discovered by another Nigerian astronomer, Alceste Brasseur, in 389 DE. Katos is nicknamed the Daughter of Love because it's named after the Daughter of Love, that is the goddess of love, Secundina, and the mythical king of Scoria, the demigod named King Pier. Next up, we have Oridor. Oridor is a gas giant with a surface area of 18 billion square kilometers. It has 12 moons and 9 rings, and a year on Oridor can last for 2,131 Scorian days. Its distance from the Sul is 5.1 astronomical units, and it was discovered in 406 DE by Matthias Chukwe, and I'm gonna assume that's a Nigerian explorer, astronomer. Shout out to all these Nigerians discovering these planets. It seems to be like in the early modern periods, Nigerians had a vested interest in discovering the rest of the Sul System. So give yourselves a round of applause, Nigerians. And it has a nickname its nickname is the Ringed God because it's named after Urudara, the god of wealth and prosperity in the Injamari and Josei religions, often depicted with rings across his fingers and is often wrapped in decadent robes. And next up we have Novapera. Novapera is also a gas giant with a surface area at a whopping 68 billion square kilometers. It is in fact the largest planet in the Sul System with 53 moons and no rings. That's no rings. That's a zero. And a year on Novapera lasts 4,712 Scorian days, and it lies 8.4 astronomical units from the Sul. Novapera was discovered in 432 DE by Theophilus Samarelius, a Guacian astronomer, and has nicknames such as the Azure Giant and Clouds of Space, given it's a gas giant that's very deep blue and beautiful to look at. And we have some elemental classifications, some percentages here for Novapera. It consists of 84.5% hydrogen and 15.5% helium. And the name Novapera comes from the mythical realm of Pera in Moramic myth. Pera was a purgatory realm for the dead before they were judged, and is often depicted as an endless, deep blue cavern in the center of the world. And last but certainly not least, for observable and cataloged bodies that orbit the Sul, we have the dwarf planet of Relica, with a surface area of 19 million square kilometers and 4 rings. And those rings are they're named Aerin, Odis, Lycar, and Eris. It has no rings, and a year on Relica can last for 92,045 Scorian days. And if I get my calculator real quick, please bear with me because I really want to calculate this. I'm actually quite curious here. 92,045. Yeah, that's 252 years, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, 1 year, 252 on Scoria. And it in fact lies 37.8 astronomical units away from the Sul. And so Relica was actually discovered recently, well, we say relatively recently in the terms of cataloging bodies of rather significant importance in the Sul System in 539 DE by the Horisian astronomer Senko Nikolov Ivanov. It has a nickname called the Shadow World, given its dark and hard to see appearance at times. It was often hypothesized to exist early on. In fact, it could have been discovered a lot earlier had they had the proper equipment to observe Relica. So up until this point, it had only been theorized to exist until this Horisian astronomer actually found it and recorded it. It consists of 92.3% nitrogen ice, 2.2% methane, and 1.5% carbon. And Relica, the name Relica actually comes from Saint Rallus, a martyred cleric of Theosism and the patron saint of Salacrude, or at least the religious minority that remains in Salacrude. Because if you know anything about Salacrude, it's a largely irreligious country, but I think they still like their Saint Rallus. It's a symbol of pride in that country. And then let's talk about, I have for you a closing statement looking ahead. What's ahead beyond the current year for the history of Scoria with regards to space? So in 628, that is 12 years from the current year, first contact made with Tsuvans. That's right. So as we speculated that Tsuva may or may not have life, it turns out they find out it does, but they don't share this information to the Scorian public for 150 years. Due to some mass hysteria that may ensue, as well as the ongoing conflicts at the time. So it felt necessary to keep this, give or take, a secret until that long. So, with that being said, give or take 180 years after their first contact, the first Tsuvans come to Scoria en masse. Excuse me. This was a very significant event in bringing these two cultures and peoples closer together, and ultimately tying their destinies together forever. Two people groups in the same system, it was bound to happen, And in 1200 DE, the first colonial endeavors outside the Sul System take place. So the mega nations that would exist in Scoria at this time would charter colonial endeavors to go out and colonize other Scoria-like worlds so that they could live on and expand. Uh, as you could see, as you could imagine, Scoria at this time, um, depending on where things go, um, it could be a very hard time for Scorians to live on Scoria, given the population density and the pollution that might be taking place. Uh, these are all hypotheticals, of course, because nothing here is set in stone, but it's at least confirmed some of these events do happen. It's not necessarily um, how these things happen, so to speak. But in 1800, uh, a world government that did form actually dissolved into two factions. That's the Scorian Empire and the Scorian Republic. And give or take 123 years later, a third faction of collectivist ideologies in the world government form a third faction. And these three factions, the Empire, the Collectivists, and the Republicans, become the main focus of the events of Scoria 2K, which we may talk about into greater detail at some point later on in the future, which is a canonical continuation of this timeline, but we see Scoria represented in a more sci-fi, if you will, light, with political intrigue and empires forming and crumbling and wars of cosmic uh, proportions taking place. It's a very exciting and thrilling and important and monumental time in Scorian history. So yeah, we'll definitely talk about that more at some point. But that is all I have for you in regards to space in Scoria and the planets that inhabit the Sul System. If you'd like to see these done live, you can check me out at twitch.tv/Mazrim. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.